candidate at Nova School of Business and Economics. Her research focuses on labor economics, gender inequality, family formation, and the distributional consequences of structural economic change. Her current work examines how technological shocks interact with existing labor market and social structures, with particular attention to women's economic outcomes. So Thais today will be focusing on some of her PhD work, and the paper is entitled "The Pink Collar Trap: Occupational Segregation and Gendered Vulnerability to AI." Just to say before we begin as well that we have NERI seminars throughout the rest of the year. Enda Keenan from the Central Bank will be discussing labour market issues in September. We have Suzanne Rogers from Social Justice Ireland and Michael Taft from SIPTU discussing Budget 2027 in October. Michal Collins from UCD looking at European attitudes to basic income, exploring women's perspectives in November. And then Dr. Alan Eustace from Trinity College Dublin discussing workers' rights in EU trade policy. So Thais will speak for 30-40 minutes, but again, we won't be too doctrinaire about exact times. And then following on from that, we'll have an opportunity for a question and answer session. And I look forward to that as well. So without further ado, Thais, you may begin. Good luck.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure being here presenting this part of my PhD thesis. Okay, so let me start a bit with my motivation. I like to motivate this work with this quote from the seminal paper on routine bias technical change from Autor, Levi, and Murnane, 2003, in which they claim that tasks demanding flexibility, creativity, generalized problem solving, and complex communications, which is what they call non-routine cognitive tasks, do not yet lend themselves to computerization. I like to highlight the end mostly because of the yet part, just because when generative AI arose, it broke this assumption, as large language models can do exactly what they define as safe before. So LLMs can perform complex communication, they can do pattern recognitions, and they can do some sort of judgment. And this is a very uncomfortable implication because the occupations that absorbed women into the 20th century formal labor market, such as office clerks, cashiers, receptionists, sales assistant, they are precisely the ones who now on are in the front line of substitution when we consider the arising of AI. These are the pink collar jobs, which the sociologist Louise Howe named in 1977, and that Golding documented as well in 1984 as the entry channel for women into the labor force. So this paper pretty much asks what happens to gender inequality when AI hits the very occupations that open the formal labor market to women. To attack that, to try to tackle that, I will need to carefully give you some important definitions in the types of concepts that I'm working here. So I follow this taxonomy from Pizzinelli and Cazzaniga from an IMF note, and also from Felton, Raj, and some co-authors on exposure and complementarity to artificial intelligence. When we talk about exposure, when we think about Felton and his co-authors in the 2021 paper, we have the question, how much of what this occupation does can AI technically touch? So they take 10 specific AI capabilities, such as language generation, image recognition, translation, and so on. And for each of them, they score how strongly it applies to the hundreds of the ONAT tasks. Just for simplification, if that's not clear for everyone, you can think about an occupation as a bundle of tasks defined in the ONAT dictionary. And then they aggregate these tasks into the bundle of the occupation to understand how important, or better, how AI can touch this occupation through the tasks. And the output will be a number that will rank among the occupations, saying if this task can be performed by AI. So it's just a measure of like potential exposure. It's not the actually adoption, but it's what AI technically can do. So for instance, just to give an example, if you think about a general office clerks that will like process documents and draft memos and manages calendars, almost all of these can be done by large language models. So they will have a high artificial intelligence occupation exposure, which is this AIOE. A construction worker, on the other hand, will mostly do physical things and so will score a low exposure level. But the thing is, the exposure alone is not enough to say how will AI affect an occupation. So you could if you think about like a medical doctor, they have a lot of tasks that can be touched by AI, such as image interpretation or, I don't know, literature reviewing. But you wouldn't conclude that they will get displaced by looking only to the exposure. Then comes the second dimension, which is the complementarity. The complementarity asks, given that AI will overlap with these tasks, will it complement the worker? And so AI will be a tool to this worker, or will it substitute the worker and AI will replace them? And so Pizzinelli and Casaniga, they build another dimension, considering communication intensity, responsibility for others, physical demands, criticality of decisions, routine, and specialized skills required to try to understand if those occupations that are exposed to AI will be boosted or they will be replaced. So, for instance, a physician will have a very high theta because though AI can help him understand like images, for instance, um, his physical presence is still necessary. So, a person will be necessary for AI to work in this occupation. Differently from the general office clerk, which can be like completely substituted. So combining those two, we find this diagram you're seeing in the right side of the presentation, in which we have a set of low exposure, in which AI will not touch enough. This is divided by the median, so it's the low side of the distribution. And in the side in which we have high exposure, we split again by complementarity being high or low. I'll give a quick example to make this very concrete for everyone. So let's think about two occupations. You have like two workers in the same day, in the same city with the same age. And you have in the side a general office clerk who works in a logistic firm. She arrives there, she do like some triage to emails, she draft 5 memos, she process expensive reports, she schedule meetings, she compile like weekly status report. By the end of the day, she's done, she goes back home, and the other day she comes back and she does exactly the same thing. In the other side, we'll have like a primary school teacher. Her day will start like reviewing past quizzes to understand which of her kids didn't understand like fractions or something. She will plan a different approach of teaching, mainly for those students. At the time of recess, she will like break up a fight among two children. She will meet with a worried parent in the afternoon because this parent thinks that her children is being bullied. And then by the end of her day, she will grade essays in which she has to judge whether she thinks the kid actually understood what she was supposed to do or whether she just wrote like nonsense. Now imagine that these two workers get access to a software that will have built in a large language model in it. For the general office clerks, the LLM alone can triage the emails, draft the memos, probably faster than she would alone. It can process expense reports straight from the spreadsheet. It can schedule the meetings by reading the thread of the emails. It can compile the reports in seconds and do almost everything that this person does, like really fast, alone, with no human interaction. For the teacher, on the other hand, we'll have different things. So we'll have the AI helping to like plan different lessons, to plan different exercise for the children who didn't understand the previous subjects. It can help with some interpretation of the essays, but at the end of the day, she will have to be the one who will judge if the final grade is fair. So the idea is that the AI will help her and will help her to spare some hours of her day and will complement her productivity. So that's the idea. We have two different occupations with sort of a close exposure, but with complementarities which are very opposite. We have a complementarity for the general office of clerk, which is in the percentile 5 of the distribution, so it's really low, versus a complementarity which is really high in the percentile 82. And that's what these measures reveals for us. So, okay, with that being said, I'll move to where this paper fits in the literature and what the literature has talked about this thing so far. We have some strands of the literature in which this paper relates. The first one, it's something I already mentioned, which is technology and labor markets, and how generative AI will break this logic, and we'll find that cognitive jobs can now enter the radar of what's displaced by technology. I already mentioned as well the exposure measurement and the complementarity. Here is just a caveat for future. I also use different measures of exposure just to be like consistent and not to believe in straightly just one classification, but the results are pretty much the same. So there is this web work, which is really interesting, that also relates capital, not only labor, and this Elandu measure, which is specific for GPT capabilities. The next trend of literature that is important is to consider what's being done about AI. We have a work on Acemoglu, author Hazel and Restrepo from 2022 called AI and Jobs, in which they see basically no effects on aggregate employment or wages. They see some sort of compositional change on hiring. They see less junior people being hired by companies, which is pretty much the story we find for other papers that find new or very small effects. The idea is that they find a firm reorganization rather than a change in the labor market. And they see also a boost in productivity, mainly when we consider like call center studies. There's a specific paper on call center studies, also on writing studies, and on programming. So those are the main tasks that have been analyzed when it comes to productivity. So you might be asking yourself, like, why would you study AI gender impact if literature has found new effects in overall? My answer to that is that the adoption is really low so far. So I'll be working with Brazilian data, and I will set the stage for you to understand why this is something that matters. But for instance, for Brazil, what we see is that only about 13% of formal firms have adopted AI so far. So the lack of results might be just a matter of timing. And when those effects of AI actually realize, my paper tried to address already who might bear the burdens of these changes. Okay, so next part of the literature is about previous automation that were actually really positive for women because it reduced segregation, both due to the fact that the physical strength premia decreased, as now we have a lot of machines that do things. They also help us with time allocation, as we have like gadgets at home right now that decrease the necessity of being home. And they also help with the arising of personal computers and typewriters, which let us enter the labor market through the same occupations I mentioned previously. And lastly, I also relate to some structural model literature, mainly the Ngai and Petroglou 2017 gender sectoral model, which is the backbone of the structural model that I create. I also relate to some selection models, and I also bring some insights from a trade model from Trailberman, in which we have the switching costs from an occupation to another, into HSIA 2019 to add some necessity for credentials for switching from one occupation to another. Okay, so moving to my paper properly, this is the research question, really straightforward, and some of the main findings I have so far. It is, how does AI adoption affect gender and inequality in the Brazilian labor market? Just a quick comment that here I'm working with gender earnings and not gender wage gap, because the possibility of displacement is a possibility. It's necessary to be taken into consideration, as some people might just lose their jobs. And so if the wage doesn't move, at least the participation moving together, we'll see the earnings, not only the wage. The main findings I have so far, and this is this is a previous version from the one that I'm working on right now, which I don't think it's still in time to be presented. But still, we have a really high concentration of young women in the job market in AI substitutable occupations versus young men who has a very lower concentration in the high exposure complementarity sector. And four occupations are the main responsible for 86% of this gap. So we have a large concentration for young women. This structural model that I built predicts an AI opening gap of 2.4 percentage points, which is mostly driven by a wage channel. And the interesting thing here is that if you measure this gap only by gender, so all men versus all women, we find that the gap barely moves. That's because of the composition of these groups within the sectors. And as the incumbents of the market, the women incumbents, they are benefited from AI, it looks like everything is the same and it will barely move. So there is this masking composition effects. And then, as I have a structural model, I provide a retraining policy in which I give extra education for 35% of young women, and this eliminates the gaps completely. So that's the point of the presentation, in which I will try to give you a good introduction of how is the Brazilian labor market and why I believe that AI might be a big deal for our structure. So as I mentioned, the timing for the entrance of AI is considered in 2024. So there's still like very few evidence on what might be going on. So my idea here is try to address the structure of the labor market and then provide a shock that will sort of pretend to be AI or will represent AI in the model and see how the structure of the labor market will lead the result. So let's start with the first fact. The concentration of young women in the high exposure low complementarity. First thing I do, I use a survey here called PNAD Continua, which is a household survey with a rotating panel. So I can follow every individual for like 5 quarters. And I have everyone here. I have formal, informal, public, private. Everyone is in this table. This is the first version of this work. Then I'll be following only with private, but for now we will be working with this complete table. And we see that for women entrant, which are the young women from 18 to 25 who are entering the labor market, we have 51% of them in these AI substitutable occupations. They are the higher group in this sector. When it comes to men, they are very insulated. They are in the low exposure sector of the economy, both young and incumbent men. While women incumbent, and it was some sort of happy surprise, they are the largest share in the higher exposure, high complementarity. So they benefit from AI more than the other groups. Just for you to have an idea of how it would look like for the formal sector strictly. Oh, okay, it's here. The divergence is really, it's higher when we look straight to the formal sector, and that's not a surprise, mainly because in informal sector, when we look for young women and for women in general here in Brazil, most of them cluster in domestic cleaning services, which are low exposure ones. So we have this increasing of the concentration of women when we only look for the formal sector. Okay. So moving on. So there are four occupations that drive 86% of this gap alone, which are shop sales assistant, general office clerks, cashiers, and receptionists. So these four occupations, they are the ones who are front-facing, customer service, routine cognitive, and they are precise the tasks, they perform the tasks that LLM can perform at a near human level. And then I'd like to mention again the historical link to the Golding 1984, which are the same occupations that were the entry channel for women into the 20th century formal labor market. And there is this irony that, and some concern, of course, that the doors that open are now, they can be the first one to close when AI hits the market. Okay. When it comes to stickiness, as I mentioned before, I have a rotating panel, which means I can follow people for 5 quarters. And I was trying to address whether those occupations, they are sticky. If it's easy to leave, if women tend to leave faster, or what happened once you are in a high exposure, low complementarity occupation. So what we see is that it's really sticky. People tend to stay, all of them, but women are the most within the groups. The young women are the ones who tend to stay more. Men are able to exit the high exposure, low complementarity 1.7 times faster than women. And when we look for labor exit in considering unemployment and also inactivity, which will help me to calibrate the model soon, we see that unemployment is very symmetrical, both for both cohorts, the entrants and the incumbents. We have really similar values. But when it comes to inactivity, it seems that women tend to move from these functions to inactivity more than men. And then we give an explanation for that, of course, because we look to household structure and we split our samples for single, partner with no kids, and partner with kids. And we see that the household structure, actually, it's very important to understand it, as the chances of married women with children to exit the labor market and go to inactivity is higher than from anyone else in the model. So that will help us to calibrate the outside option of someone who is deciding whether to stay or not in an occupation. Okay, so let's go for the structural model itself. As I mentioned, I still have no clear evidence of the effects of AI in the Brazilian data, mostly because our administrative data from firms is still in 2025, so it's really close to adoption of the adoption of the AI moment. But I'll still try to understand, given these facts about the labor market, how the labor market would react to a change to different sets of the market itself. So I'll build a model which is a raw style discrete choice, in which I have a worker I that can belong to a group, which is being a women entrant or a men entrant or a women incumbent, men incumbent. They have a household type, which means that they are single, they are married with no kids, or they are married with kids. And they can choose about their destination. So they can stay in the sector they are, which is the age goes for the high complementarity, L for low complementarity, E for low exposure, and out if they quit the market. And what happens now is that each worker will choose what to do. They can choose to change from where they are right now to another sector, but if they do so, they will activate a cost of switching, which is represented by this kappa. So it will be costly to switch, as you were already trained for your occupation. And there is an extra thing which is very important, which is the fact that there exists an education barrier to join the high exposure, high complementarity sector. So I will give a very exaggerate example here just to make my point clear. Let's suppose you work as a general office clerk and you face your wage decreasing due to the fact that now your tasks are different and you just have to like operate a computer or something. Once you face that, you will decide what to do. Economically, you would choose to go to a sector in which you would have a higher wage. So let's suppose that the boost in productivity in like being a petroleum engineer doubled the wage for a petroleum engineer. If I don't add this educational barrier here, the high exposure, high complementary sector would absorb everyone. But it's not everyone that can be a petroleum engineer. So the idea here is that the only people in my model that can join the high exposure, high complementarity sector are the ones who have a tertiary degree. So I will have a distribution of education here. And if you, my fictional agent, drew having 15 or more years, you can join the high exposure, high complementarity sector. If not, this cost will be infinite and you will never choose to move to the high exposure, high complementarity sector. So that's pretty much the idea. You will balance your options considering what you have, and you will decide if you stay in the function you have, and if you stay, you will face the decrease in the wages. Maybe you're trapped in that decision, and that's a possibility, of course. And if you can, you will move to the area that will makes you happier, and it will give you a higher utility. And if even that, considering your group, your household type, you might choose to go out of the labor market because the outside option will be higher, which is this second line. Okay, so I will basically create these workers. Let's talk a bit about the AI shock and the wage formation in this version of the model. This model that I'm presenting to you right now, it deploys a lot of dedication to the supply side of the labor market, and I'm still enhancing the demand side of the labor market, which is what I'm presenting to you right now. So in this version, we have the complementarity as a measure of increasing in the productivity of the worker. So we have an extra factor in the TFP of each of the sectors, which will be augmented if you are in the high exposure, high complementarity sector. So you have a boost in productivity, which will be reflected in your wage. And if you have a substitute, so if you have the theta, which is low enough, lower than the median, you will have a decrease in your productivity and a decrease in your wage. These whole things will be parameterized by this intensity parameter kappa plus and kappa less and alpha LE, which I take from Acemoglu, just as an intensity parameters to say that the losses tend to be higher than the winnings in the situations of technological change. And I also allow for these modest spillover of 0.02 for the low exposure sector, as in the spirit of everything is going great, things are getting better for some part, this area will benefit a bit from it. And the wage formation will be just the first derivative of the production function, which so far here it's just labor dependent. I'm trying to enhance this part of the model using a CES production function that also includes the capital of AI here. Yeah, still, let's check what happens so far. So, okay, I have 6 target models. So I calibrate the sector shares and the labor force participation rates. I use the switching costs from Penade Continua transitions to the different groups to choose differently the outside option of being inactive. I add this education barrier, and then I simulate 400,000 workers to understand what will happen once we have this shock in productivity. Okay, so the version of the model, the fit is really good. And the results are really interesting. So the first thing we find is that if I add no friction, so I don't have any switching costs from moving from my occupation to a different one, I still have a gap. I still find a wage gap, even though this is not, the frictions are not there. When I add the stickiness, which is pretty much the idea that you will have that small cost to switching from my occupation to another one, I pretty much increase 0.9 percentage points. And once I add the barrier, the education barrier, it gets even bigger. It pretty much doubles to an extra 2.43 percentage points. That's for the entrant group. So I'm looking for the gap among the young cohort. And this is a comparison for what happens when we compare different cohorts. So that's the one I showed you, the 2.43. When we compare also gender and career stage, as expected, it is larger. The gap from women entrant, young women versus men incumbent, it's larger. It increases in 3.44 percentage points. But when we look for the incumbents, which are the people who are in the market for a longer time and who are in different stages of career, it looks like the gap actually decreases. That's the masking effect I mentioned before. It's the idea that as women incumbent, they are mostly the ones who benefit from high exposure, high complementarity boost in productivity. Their winning offset the losses of the young cohort. And this is very interesting because if anyone concludes anything based on the aggregation of everything in the all women versus all men, it might conclude that nothing will change. But once you look for the young people, those are the ones who needs more attention. When we decompose what happens here, like what's pushing what, if it's wage reallocation or exit from the labor force, and these results must be read with a very cautious side, just because as I'm changing the demand side for labor, things are changing a bit, and the exit channel is getting a bit stronger. But here, from what we have, if we consider only the supply side of the labor market, we'll have the effects being pushed mostly for wages. So what changes is the wages of the market due to the boost in the productivity. And then the cool part of doing models, at least in my opinion, the cool parts of doing this general equilibrium model is that you can create the policy that you want to test and to understand how this will affect the whole thing in the model. So the first thing I do is that I remove the educational barrier. I quit that 15 years demanding to move to the high exposure, high complementarity sector. But the thing is that the gap actually increases if it's just a matter of removing the barrier. That because it's not a barrier removal just for women, which are the ones who are being damaged the most by what we see, but everyone can benefit from moving to the high exposure, high complementarity sector. And given that some of the women will decide to quit either way, and men will benefit also from this increase in wages, the effect, the general effect on the earning gap will be larger than if we had the barrier. The second thing, which I believe is the coolest part, is the retraining policy. So here is like if I gave education to 35% of women, entrant women, I give them like a credential to advance. I gave them some sort of training to be able to advance to the other sector. The gap not only reverse, but it actually goes to the women's side, right? So we are able to diminish the current gap by 4.95 percentage points. Yeah. So basically in the model, what I do is that I take random 35% of women and gave them this credential. And then there is another important thing is that I do this policy of desegregation, which means that I change their distributions for start. I change their start and I allow women to have men's distribution among the sectors. And still I find an opening gap, and a larger opening gap. But that's again because of the other things that lead women to have a different response. So they will choose more to quit the market than men, for instance. There are other factors that are not only explainable by the state of the labor market, but mostly by their personal choices. That's pretty much that. And then I do like a compose policy in which I give the education and I also change the distribution. And of course, the gap will decrease and will be even a larger decrease than if I just gave the retraining. But the cool part here, and I think that's a main A main message from this work is that education is really key, whatever we're facing any sort of technological change. So the key takeaways of these. First of all, composition. This is really important. Half of young women, when we consider everyone, and 62% when we consider only the formal market, are in occupations that might be substituted by AI. And we have four main occupations that drive this gap. That's a really high occupational concentration, and it can generate a really high vulnerability to AI. Second part, regarding this model, the wage channels are the one that drives the results. It's not labor force exit. At least, again, these results must be read with very cautious eyes. Third part, and that remains even when I change the model. There is this masking story. As incumbent women are able to benefit from AI complementarity jobs, they cancel out the entrant losses. And if you pull everyone together, you will miss this vulnerability and you will miss the focus of policy if you want to address the situation, which should be the young generations. Fourth point, education is the lever. Retraining is the most important counterfactual, and it can help eliminate the AI-induced widening. Last thing, and I think that's really important, the AI shock I provided to the model, it's gender neutral. It does not treat women and men differently in any way. So the model does not have any sort of target on being worse for any sort of gender. But the idea is that the pre-existing setting of the occupational segregation, the switching costs, the educational barriers that all come from the data, they are the ones that led the outcome of the increase in the gender gap to arise. And then, just to finish for future steps, I am currently working in a labor demand side, which also will increase and enhance the labor supply side, which is try to adapt the task-based model following Acemoglu and Restrepo 2022. This will make the results better, as I will actually have a general equilibrium for sure, as I will have supply and demand. Second thing, I will restrict the model only for the private formal sector, and that's for two reasons. And the second one is the cooler, which is the fourth topic here, which is I just got access to highest data set here in Brazil, which is the administrative data from formal employment relations. And I'm able to track everyone through their lifetime in formal works. So I can see actually if here in Brazil, the pink collar occupations are still the doors to entering the labor market for women, and that they migrate slowly to better occupations, as we see in the age composition. And the last thing is, of course, adding important extra heterogeneity. First thing, let's think about single parents. In my model so far, I just have parents who are married. I would like to consider race as well in region, as Brazil is a very diverse and large place to evaluate. And that's it. Thank you very much. Comments are welcome. Feel free to make any questions. Every feedback is great in the stage of the working paper that I'm working now.